I'm brewing the wonderful beer style of Italian Pilsner. I'm using an approach known as all grain, meaning I start with malted barley and turn it into beer. And I'm explaining the entire process step by step with a few twists along the way.
What a contraption.
How will the finished beer turn out? Let's find out.
I'm Martin Keane and I have brewed over 100 different styles of beer down here in my basement brewery. And today I'm going to show you how to brew a beer starting with malted barley all the way through to the finished product. If you've never brewed a beer before, well, you're going to see the whole process from beginning to end. And if you do have some brewing experience, well, I think you might enjoy some of the tips and tricks I'm going to employ along the way. Let's get started. So let's start by talking about the equipment I'm using. Everything here is from the same vendor, actually, from Clawhammer Supply, starting with this brewing system. Now, of all these beers that I've brewed, almost all of them have been using this system here. This is effectively a brewing kettle. This is an electric system, and how this works is this basket here is used to store the beer grain. And in here we have an electrical heating element that is going to heat up the water to a particular temperature. And that is controlled by this controller here, which sets the temperature by cycling this heating element on and off. I'm using the 120 volt controller that just plugs into a standard outlet in the US here. There's also a 240 volt version of this controller. You would need a dedicated plug for that, similar to a dryer plug in the US. That will give you faster heat up times, but today I'm just using the standard 120 volt. In addition to this system, it comes with a pump, and I'll show you how that works in a moment. So this will handle everything on the hot side of making beer. Then we need to ferment the beer, which is done cold, and then serve the beer. And this is going to provide me both of those things. So this is a fermentation keg. So I will ferment the beer in here and also serve it out of here as well. If you don't have something like this, you could use a plastic bucket with a lid and an airlock for your fermentation, and then either move that into a bottle or into a regular keg. And then finally, the other piece of equipment I'll be using today is this grain mill. So speaking of grain, let's talk about ingredients. So here are the ingredients I'm going to be using today. In this bucket here, I have malted barley. What is malted barley? Well, it's barley grain that has been soaked in water, allowed to germinate, and then heated to stop that germination process. That heating process is called kilning, and the temperature that you use and the time that you use in the kiln determines how dark the malt is. Now in this case I'm using pretty light malt, and that's because I'm brewing a light beer. I'm brewing an Italian Pilsner, and what I have in here is 10 pounds of Pilsner malt and then half a pound of Carapils. Next ingredient, hops. Now the hops provide the bitterness to the beer, but also contribute to the flavor and aroma, which is actually quite important with the beer style I'm brewing today. They smell delicious. And these are pelletized versions of hops. So rather than putting in full hop cones, which you can do, it's more common to see pellet hops because they're smaller, they're easier to manage, and that's what I'll be using today. Now at the end of the brewing process today, I would have created something called wort, which is a very sugary liquid, and if we just left it there, it would not be in any way beer. We need to get alcohol in there, and that will also dry out the beer as well, make it less sweet. To do that, we rely on yeast, brewer's yeast. Now yeast comes in typically dry yeast or liquid yeast types, and I'm going to be using a dry yeast. This is a dry lager yeast, Saflager W3470. Oh, and there is one other ingredient, water. Let's get that added now. Put the grain basket in. This is where we'll be putting the grain in a moment. And the only one change I'm going to make to my water is to add half of a Camden tablet. And this will work on the chlorine and chloramine that may be in my water. You really don't want chlorine or chloramine in your finished beer. And yeah, just putting a Camden tablet in goes a long way to clearing that up. Now we need to heat this water to a very specific temperature for the mash process. And I am going to use my Clawhammer Supply controller here. So I'm going to plug in the thermometer into the thermal well. And I've set it to 149 Fahrenheit or 64 Celsius. I'm going to turn the heat on. So the bottom number on here is the temperature that I want. The top number on here is the current temperature of the water. All right, while that's heating up, let's get the grain ready. Now the first stage that we're going to do is called the mash, and what the mash does is it uses enzymes in the malt to convert the starches in the malt into fermentable sugars. But if I just threw the malt directly into the hot water, not much would happen. We need to expose the starches that are in these grains in order for the enzymes to be able to do their thing. So that's what this grain mill will do. It's pretty simple. It just consists of 2 rollers. We put the grains in the top and the crushed grains come out the bottom. All right, got my grains in. Now this particular grain mill, it comes with a crank handle you can use to turn. Far too lazy for that. This will get it done. Now this is what the grain looks like when it's crushed up. I actually performed a double crush, so once the grain went through the mill, I then dumped it back out and put it through the mill a second time. You can buy your grain already pre-crushed. Even if you do get that, I like to run through the double crush, and that's because I'm using this brew in a basket system here, where the grain is just going to sit in this mesh basket. Okay, now I've heated my water. I was aiming for 149, I'm actually at 153. Oh no, is that a disaster? Actually, I like to go a little bit over the temperature because when I add in the grains, it's going to bring the temperature down a bit. Okay, let's add in the grains. It's a messy process, particularly when you double crush because it's all quite fine. Right, now I'm going to take my mash paddle and I just need to make sure that there are no clumps in here. So I'm going to give this a stir, and it is quite clumpy right now. Where you have clumps, you're going to get a much less efficient conversion of those starches to sugars. You can see that the temperature has now dropped now I've added those grains in. I've temp gone slightly below where I want to be. Now at this point we could just leave the grains sat in here at a certain temperature, but again, to increase the efficiency of the conversion, I'm going to recirculate. So this system is hooked up to a pump, and the pump is going to recirculate from the bottom out here into the pump and then back out through this tube here, and that's going to go through a spray nozzle at the top. So open that up and turn it on. So what's going to happen now is the water is going to fall through this mash bed of grains, and then it's going to get sucked up by the pump and then sent back through the top and recirculate again. And it's just going to keep on going through this cycle. So I'm going to get this back up to 149 Fahrenheit by turning that heat back on. And I'm just going to leave this now mashing in that continuous process for about an hour. There's really nothing I need to do now other than wait, come back. Well, it's been an hour, so I can turn off the recirculation and the heat. Now the next thing I need to do is to separate the grains from the water, which has now become wort. So to do that is a case of pulling this basket out. I've actually got a little bit of help for that task today using this pulley. So you can hear that, that's the water draining out of this basket now. This isn't a particularly high gravity beer, but for high gravity beers where the basket is full, it can get quite heavy. So having a pulley is handy, although generally it's fairly straightforward just to pull it out yourself. And while that's draining, I'm going to heat this up to boiling. So I'm going to press this button here, AM, that's 100% power, and then press heat. And now the heating element will just stay on the whole time and get me to boil. Excuse the noise, I've got my extractor fan running now. Now, we have sweet wort, but we're not ready to pitch the yeast yet because we need to bring that wort to boil. Now, why are we boiling? There's essentially 2 reasons for that. One is sanitation. So by boiling this wort, we'll kill off anything that's in here that we don't want, bacteria, wild yeast, that sort of thing. And secondly, it's because we need to add hops to add bitterness, and to do that, we need to be at a high temperature. So to add my hops, I'm going to use this hop sleeve here. And that's because when I add the hops in, they expand quite a lot and they can start to gunk things up, especially because I'm using a pump. So all of the hop matter will stay in here. Now I have 2 hop additions to add at different times in the boil, and they're going to do different things. I'm going to add my first hop addition now, which is considered the bittering hop, and here I have 19 grams of magnum hops. So as I'm just reaching boil here now, I'm going to add those in. Now when we add hops in at this stage, we are going to extract the alpha acids from those hops and cause bitterness. Now this happens in a process called isomerization, and this is effectively dissolving those alpha acids into the wort where they will form bitterness. Now I have an additional hop addition here. I'm going to add this in at 10 minutes to go. This is Hallertau Mittelfrüh, and I have 28 grams of that. And by adding that in with just 10 minutes left in the boil, there's going to be less time for isomerization, and therefore less time to extract those alpha acids and add bitterness to the beer. What we'll end up with is more of the hop oils staying in the worts that haven't been isomerized, and that will contribute to the flavor and aroma of the beer. Now typically you would boil for 60 to 90 minutes. I almost never boil for that long anymore. This is going to be a 30-minute boil. There really isn't a lot of reason with modern malts and modern hops to have to go longer than that if you don't want to. The only thing with a shorter boil is you will need to add slightly more hops in at the start because they will have less time to isomerize, but we're only talking about a couple of grams. Alright, so I'm going to let this boil for 30 minutes, then we'll move on to the next stage. Boil is done. I'm now chilling the wort down using a plate chiller. This is something that also came with this 4-hammer setup here. So the way the plate chiller works is I send cold water in, and that runs through a number of channels, and I'm also pumping in my wort, and that goes through some separate channels, and the water effectively cools the wort as it passes through these plates in the plate chiller, as it comes out much cooler. It's recycling back into my kettle here. Now I'm actually going to move this into my fermenter, which is my keg, so let's do that. Alright, so the chilled wort is going into my fermenter. Now once we start dealing with things post-boiled, we need to be concerned about sanitation. So I use a product which is just essential to homebrew called Starsan. It's an acid sanitizer, and I just filled this keg up with water, added some Starsan to it, that all foams up, dump that out, and now I know that my keg here is sanitized and ready to receive this chilled wort. Now beer is in the keg. Now you'll notice here I have, this is a floating dip tube. Now at this point it's a good practice to take a gravity reading, and what this does is it looks at the density of the wort to figure out basically how much sugar is in it. Now the normal way to do that is to use a hydrometer, so you just get a sample of the wort, drop this in, and then you look for the measurement here, and that would tell you what your gravity is. I'm going to actually use a density meter. So I've taken a sample of the wort as I was transferring in here, and then I'm going to put it into this density meter until the wort flows through the other side, and then on my phone I'm going to say start measurement. Okay, and that's given me a gravity of 1.04. Now if this were just straight up water, the gravity would be 1.0. So this shows me how much sugar I have in here. I'm going to take another measurement of this gravity once fermentation is finished, and then I will know when I look at the delta between this gravity, called the original gravity, and the gravity after fermentation, called the final gravity, what my alcohol percentage is in this beer. Speaking of alcohol, there's not going to be any alcohol in here until we add some yeast. Now this is lager yeast, and on the packet it says that the lager yeast temperature recommendation is 53 to 64 Fahrenheit. Lager yeasts generally operate at colder temperatures, so a little bit colder than room temperature. But here's one of the hacks that I'm employing. Because I'm using this keg, I'm actually going to pitch this yeast at room temperature. Let's get this yeast in. I'm just going to sprinkle it over the top of the wort. Firstly sanitizing it. This is my Starsan, and then just sprinkle in my yeast. Now if you ferment lager yeast too warm, what can happen is you will get more ester and fusel alcohol production than you want, and that can lead to off flavors in the lager. But there's a way to suppress that by fermenting under pressure. By fermenting under pressure, you could typically not worry too much about temperature control. Now if I don't have that ability, I need to take this wort and I need to put it in a temperature controlled environment like a fridge set to the temperature range that I want. But I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to leave this sitting around the basement here. The way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to use this pressure gauge, which is also a spunding valve. Now this is set so that you will connect it up to the gas post here. That's this side. Right now it shows a pressure of nothing. There's no pressure in here. But I've set this to 12 psi, which is to say if pressure builds beyond 12 psi, it will be vented out here. So the inside of this keg will stay at 12 psi. How's it going to go from 0 to 12 psi? Well, as the yeast start to consume that sugar, they are going to create CO2. That's what builds the pressure, and we will need to vent off the CO2 once it gets above 12 psi. Okay, so there's really nothing more to do now than just to let the yeast do its thing, go to work on this wort. And when the fermentation starts to come to an end, I'm going to move on to the next step, which is dry hopping. So the beer has been in the keg fermenting for a few weeks now, and it's time for the dry hop edition. And what I've got here are 2 sets of hops. So I have 28 grams or 1 ounce of Hallertau Mittelfrüh and Czech Saaz hops. And I need to get these into my fermenter. Now, just the easy way to do this would be to just like pop off the top, pour them in, shut it off again. That's what I normally do. But I'm going to try and be a little bit clever this time with this thing. Once the beer has finished fermenting, which this probably has or is close to at this point, we need to be very careful about introducing oxygen because that can oxidize the beer. It's one of the big off flavors that you really want to avoid if you can. So what I'm going to try to do is introduce the hops without introducing any excess oxygen by using this as kind of an airlock. All right, so let's give this a go. I've got some water here with some star san. Again, sanitation is important. We don't want to introduce anything into this beer that shouldn't be there. And now at the top of this, I've capped this here with a butterfly valve, which means I can connect something to this. I'm going to connect this. Now this is closed, so opening this is not going to expose the beer to anything. I'm also just going to let the gas out of here. And we'll clamp this back on. What a contraption. I'm going to put my hops in. So what we've got now is we've got the hops added into this sight glass container here, and we also have a little bit of oxygen, actually quite a bit. So if I were to open the butterfly valve right now, the hops would fall in, but then also any oxygen that's in here. So we need to try to do our best to purge it. So I've got some CO2 here. I'm going to hook it up. Yeah, it's got a little bit of pressure in it, and I'm going to bleed it out here. All right, so now we have basically a CO2 blanket in here, plus the hops. Time to add them in by just pulling on the butterfly valve. A bit of a tap. There we go. In they go. Shut that back down. And there we go. Now, was that strictly necessary? No. Do you need all this equipment to be able to dry hop a beer? No. In fact, I've never dry hopped a beer this way, but this is quite a cool way to make sure that you're not introducing too much oxygen in. I'm going to leave these dry hops in here for a few more days, then move on to the next stage. And that next and final stage was to add some pressure to the keg, put it in the fridge and let it cold crash for a few days. And now the beer is ready. Here's what it looks like. Beautiful golden color, nice creamy white head. What do I get on the aroma? Yeah, a really sort of fresh hop smell, which I would imagine would come mainly from that dry hop charge, but quite subtle, nothing too crazy in the hop department. Let's try the taste. Well, that's my first homebrewed Italian Pils. Well, that's really good. You've definitely got the maltiness shining through as the primary thing, kind of a soft maltiness. And then for the hops, there's this very pleasant hop aroma coming through. Quite bright, a little flowery, I would say. Touch earthy perhaps, but mainly a bright hop flavor. This is an incredibly refreshing drink. So that's how to brew a beer. Now, I've gone kind of all out here and done some steps you probably didn't really need to do, like with the dry hopping and so forth. But that's the beauty of homebrewing. You get to experiment with all sorts of different processes and stages. Everything I used is linked in the description below, and honestly, I'm really delighted how this one turned out. Cheers.